sector and government into being more entrepreneurial. When I was president, we got an enormous number of our new jobs from small business. But the small businesses were being spurred by the fact that information technology in the 1990s spread into every aspect of the economy. So that when I look back on those 8 years, IT employment was only 8% of the total, but it was more than 20% of the growth and more than 25% of the wage growth of the country. And it's the only time since the 1980s in our country when the bottom 20% earnings in percentage terms increased as much as the top 20%. We have to find ways to try to create this kind of entrepreneurial culture where we all focus more on what works. And meanwhile, to try to support the creation of more entrepreneurs. I'll give you just a few examples. In Haiti, where I spend a lot of my life now, before the earthquake, and let me back up and say one thing. I find that the problems of dealing with these challenges and seizing the opportunities manifest themselves very differently in poor countries, in rising economies, and in developed countries. And you may be able to identify with some of this in the work you do. But in really poor countries, what they often need are basic systems that many of you are in the process of leaving behind. If you have enough money to have solar panels on your roof or a windmill on your farm, you may not need the grid. But if you live in Haiti, 85% of the people have no electricity at all in their homes. They need systems. Systems that you never even think about. Just think about all the stuff we're taking for granted here. You'd be surprised if the screen went off, or if the microphone failed, or the lights went dark, or the air conditioning didn't work. If you get really bored with my speech, you can excuse yourself. You can go to the loo or get a glass of water. I spend a lot of my time in places where people can't take any of that for granted. In a stunning metaphor of the challenges faced by poor countries, the microphone failed when the president of Haiti was giving his inaugural address. It turned out it was a person who opposed him who actually cut the cord, so we fixed it. So I spent a lot of my time just trying to help build these systems. In China, Russia, India, Brazil, Mexico, the centers of prosperity have these systems, but they're trying to figure out how to spread them. So they have to both figure out how to keep on this modernization path they're on and how to connect to people who aren't part of it at all. Rich countries have systems, but they tend to become rigidified, more interested in holding on to present gain than creating future opportunity, more interested in holding on to position than advancing the purpose for which the institutions were set up in the first place. This is basic human nature. It's as old as the Sumerian civilization 8,000 years ago. It's always what tests advanced societies. And it's really hard when these systems have to multitask, which is basically what Europe and America are facing now. If you have a lot of big structural debt that can't be handled over the long run, you have to retrench. If you retrench too soon in an economic downturn, you make the situation worse. That's the dilemma that the UK faces, that the Eurozone faces, that America faces. So what I've been trying to argue for the last few years in America is we should have a 10-year plan to reduce our debt that should trigger ever more steeply as economic growth returns, then you're blocking the rise of high interest rates. If you do it too soon, what happens? You just stay flat, because you cannot possibly, no matter how much you cut spending or raise taxes, revenues will still drop and your deficits will go up, because once interest rates are below the rate of inflation, that tells you that there's not enough private activity, and the public sector has to do something to keep trying to spark economic growth. When private activity takes off, there'll be more demand for capital, interest rates will rise, you can worry about the deficit. So the markets say, no, 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 you have these unsustainable debts. We want to see that you're serious. Well, you can show them that you're serious, but if you act like you are before the time comes, all you do is make the debt worse. So this is a sort of challenging governmental decision that all of society has to be involved in. On the other hand, it's a great time to start a business if you can figure out what it's going to look like 5 years from now. When things are bad, it's a good time to move. If you're gifted with the ability to have a good sense of what will be needed when things aren't so bad anymore. So in that maelstrom, we need more innovators. We need more people who can imagine a future that is different from the past. Not people that are just focused on fixing something that happened yesterday so it doesn't happen again. And I personally believe one of the great challenges, not only for government, but for big private economic organizations and for NGOs, is to figure out how to become constant innovators, how to become relentlessly future-focused, how to look at a situation that seems irreconcilable and just try something. The great thing I like about being in the position I'm in now with an NGO is, unlike a business, I don't have to answer to my investors, but I'm not a public company. They don't expect me to run a profit. All I have to do is balance the books. Unlike a politician, which I was happily for nearly 30 years, if I screw up, I can say I did. This is important. We should start rewarding politicians for saying, I tried this, it didn't work, I failed, I stopped, now let's do something else. I wish there was I wish one of these organizations that gives people awards would set up an award system for innovative political leaders who try things that don't work, admit it to their voters, say we tried this, here's why we tried it, it didn't work, we stopped, we're not wasting your money anymore, and here's what we learned, so we're going to try that. Think how real it would be. It would be so much better than... You know, in politics, people are so afraid of bad press articles, they spend way too much time and energy trying to cover their backside. And it's not conducive to the kind of entrepreneurial, creative decision-making process that we all desperately need in every part of our society. So I like it when people ask me, you know, what do you think the biggest mistakes you make were as president? If you had a do-over, what would you change? I like that. Because it's inconceivable that a person could make thousands and thousands and thousands of decisions with imperfect information in a limited time frame and never err. And the idea that we have to create this sort of mythical image of people, instead of realizing, I hired a person to do a job. They made a lot of decisions. The end result was good. Not all the decisions worked out so well. Here were the ones that didn't work out so well and what we can learn from it. We need to create this kind of climate in the political systems of every country on earth. We all say we want innovators, we want people with an entrepreneurial spirit. You have to have the right to fail and admit it so you can succeed. Because if everyone knew what to do about every inequality, instability, and unsustainability challenge of the world, I'd be here talking about something else because all those problems would be solved. But let me just give you a few examples. When I left the White House in 2001, we had just arranged to set up the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria, but it had not yet been funded. The American program, which provides a lot of the world's funding that President Bush started, PEPFAR, had not yet been funded. So Nelson Mandela Nevis, who is a medical doctor, and keep in mind this is 11 years ago, so he says to me, look, Bill, we don't have a denial problem on AIDS. We don't have a discrimination problem. We have a money and an organization problem. I said, well, what do you want me to do about it? He said, I want you to fix it. Now, at the time, I had about 8 employees, and I was busy building a library, which is something former presidents normally do, build a library, museum, and a public policy center. And I was trying to build America's first graduate school in public service as opposed to public policy, which we did. It's the only place where you spend half your time in the field solving problems and only half your time in the classroom. But anyway, he said, I want you to fix it. And I said, okay. I had no clue what I was agreeing to. But here's what we found. In the Bahamas, the wealthiest country in the Caribbean, they actually had enough money to begin treating people on AIDS. They were buying generic medicine produced in India for sale at $500 a person a year. The market was so disorganized, they were paying $3,500 for this $500 medicine. Because no one knew what the prices was, there was no supply chain. They were going through 2 different agents who were taking massive markups. I had good relationship with India and with these countries. So we called and got them to send the money direct to the Bahamas, and their price dropped from 35 to 5, and we could treat more than 6 times as many people for the same amount of money. And I thought, boy, this is going to be, I thought, well, this is going to be easy. It's my first week on the job. But it got a little harder, but here's what we discovered. That since only 200,000 people in the developing world, including 130,000 in Brazil, which has its own pharmacy manufacturing operation, we're getting this, even at $500, much less than the $10,000 a year the big pharmaceutical companies were charging in the wealthy countries. Generic AIDS medicine was a low volume, high profit margin, uncertain payment business. There was no guaranteed funding stream. You were selling into the poorest places in the world. So I went to the Prime Minister of Ireland, which has a very active aid program, and the Prime Minister of Canada, and I said, would you give me $20 million a year for 5 years? Promise $100 million. I don't want you to give me the money. I want you to pick the countries with high AIDS problems you would like to help, and promise me you will release the money only when I say okay. So they did. Then I made an agreement with the countries that they would follow a strict disclosure, 100% no corruption policy in the distribution of the medicine. And then we went back to the Indians. And I said, you realize you've got this huge global public health epidemic. And you're running this business as if you had a jewelry store in a very small town. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, think about it. Like in my hometown in Arkansas where I grew up. The local jeweler was a friend of mine. He had a low volume, high profit margin, uncertain payment business. Why? Because if you run a jewelry store, you have to keep a lot of inventory, right? It costs a lot of money. People want to look at the watches, or the bracelets, or the necklace. And so that means your profit margin's got to be pretty high for every item you sell, because the volume you keep compared to the items you sell is not optimal. And then it's an uncertain payment business because someone might bring the engagement ring back. Right? Doesn't always work out. So the guy started to laugh, but I could see he was thinking about it. You know, they were thinking about it. I said, we should run this like a vast food store chain. Huge volume, low profit margin, absolutely certain and prompt payment. He said, how are you going to do this? And I told him what we'd done, and that we were going to fix the supply chain. Anyway, I'll make a long story short. We went from the medicine was $500 for adults, $600 for children, which was cheaper to produce in terms of materials, the children's medicine, but the volumes were very low. Over the next few years, it dropped from 500 to 190 to 160 to 120 to 90, and the children's drugs dropped from 600 to 60. And every time, and the deal we made with our Indian and subsequent South African partners, was that if they didn't make more money doing it this way, we would rewrite the contract. I gave them my word. I didn't want them to lose money. But first there were just these two countries, then Ireland and Canada. Pretty soon others started helping. Then the Global Fund came on, then the PEPFAR funds came on, and the price just kept dropping like a rock because the business model changed. Think of how many people would be dead today and how much money would have been wasted if we hadn't first had to change the economic model. There are lots of things like that in the world. And ironically, we were probably fortunate that we got to change the economic model before the money poured in, because the money then poured into a much more efficient system. And now we've applied the same thing thanks partly to DFID. You should be very proud of this, whatever your political party is. I think it's great, even though you already know, I think both the United States and the UK and Europe jumped the gun on this austerity. I think they needed to have an austerity plan that didn't implement itself, that wasn't implemented so soon. I'm really proud of the UK for not cutting back on foreign assistance to poor countries. It's a great thing for the world, and you should be too. So then DFID started to help us, and a lot of other countries did, and the Gates Foundation did. And we applied this model to testing equipment and laboratory equipment, and then to malaria drugs. And eventually we got the big pharmaceutical industry in it because Pfizer, America's biggest company, produces the only drug in the world you can take if you have tuberculosis and AIDS to treat the tuberculosis that doesn't make you so sick you can't function. It saves lives and you can function normally. They gave us a 60% discount. And I said, why are you doing this? And this is attitudinal. This is how